Before all my colleagues at the biggest night of my career, my own daughter snatched the microphone and announced I was losing my mind. This award ceremony was a pointless waste of time. Her husband laughed. I slowly stood up, said 5 calm words, and the lawyer in the front row opened his briefcase. She fainted right there on the spot. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Edward Murphy. I'm 68 years old and I live at 2847 North Levitt Street in Chicago's Lincoln Square neighborhood. A 2-story brick house with a front porch I've sat on through every season this city has thrown at me. I spent 31 years as a senior assistant state's attorney for Cook County before I retired. These days I arbitrate civil disputes part-time and spend my evenings with a contrabass and a turntable. People who worked with me used to say Edward doesn't get angry. He builds a case. I never corrected them. It's a useful reputation to have. I bought this house in the spring of 1991 for $187,000. I remember the number exactly because I signed the mortgage documents on a Tuesday afternoon and then drove home and ate a cold sandwich standing over the kitchen sink, too proud to sit down. That house is worth $840,000 today. I know, because someone had it appraised recently. I'll get to that. My daughter Nicole is 38 years old. She married a man named Crispin Ward about 6 years ago. And for the first couple of years I genuinely liked him, or told myself I did. Crispin has the kind of confidence that fills a room before he does. Broad shoulders, expensive haircut, always a little too well dressed for the occasion. He talks about business deals the way other men talk about the weather constantly, with great conviction and with very little follow-through. 3 ventures in 5 years. And most recently something involving logistics optimization that he explained at Thanksgiving using so many buzzwords I stopped counting after the 12th one. My Nicole was not always this way. When she was young, she used to sit on this very porch and ask me to explain my cases. Not the gory parts, but the logic of it. How did you know, Dad? She had a sharp instinct for when someone was being dishonest. I was proud of her for that. I don't know exactly when she stopped using that instinct on the people around her and started using it only on me. 2 years ago, she called me on a Sunday evening. Crispin's latest venture had hit a temporary cash flow challenge, her words, and they needed somewhere to stay while they figured things out. A few months, she said. I said yes without hesitating. She was my daughter. The house had 2 empty bedrooms. The first 3 months were fine. Nicole cooked on weekends. Crispin took out the recycling. I noticed the way he looked at the house, sometimes measuring, but I filed it away as nothing. I've prosecuted enough people to know what the early stages of a plan look like. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. It started small the way these things always do. Nicole began reorganizing the kitchen, not asking. Reorganizing. One morning I went to make coffee and found the mugs had been moved to a cabinet I hadn't opened in 6 years. It makes more sense this way, she told me when I mentioned it. There was something in her tone. Patient. Careful the tone you use. With someone you're managing rather than speaking to. I let it go. A cabinet is a cabinet. Then Crispin started speaking about me in the third person while I was standing in the same room. The first time it happened, I thought I'd misheard. We were in the kitchen, the newly reorganized kitchen, and our neighbor Sandra stopped by to return a casserole dish. Crispin was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. And when Sandra asked how I'd been adjusting to retirement, he answered before I could open my mouth. He's doing okay, he said. Not to me. About me like I was a houseplant someone had asked after. He's been a little forgetful lately, but we keep an eye on him. I looked at him. He smiled at Sandra and did not look back at me. Forgetful. The word sat in my chest like a splinter. Over the following weeks, I started cataloging. It's an occupational habit. You spend long enough building cases, and you begin building them automatically. Nicole mentioned my memory issues to 2 separate people in front of me each time with the practiced sadness of someone carrying a private burden. She told our neighbor Ron that I'd left the stove on twice last month. I had not left the stove on once. She told her friend Patrice that she was worried about Dad being alone in the house. This, while I was sitting 8 feet away, reading the Tribune. Kristen, for his part, had begun asking questions, casual questions, slipped into normal conversations like bones in a fillet of fish. Have you thought about simplifying your finances, Edward? At your age, it might make sense to consolidate things. Or some guys I play golf with have set up arrangements with their kids just to make things easier down the road. He said down the road the way some people say before you die, as if the phrase were interchangeable and as if I were too dim to notice. I noticed. The moment that changed everything came on a Thursday evening in the middle of winter. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen, about to pour myself a glass of water when I heard Nicole's voice from inside. Clear and unhurried, the tone people use when they're confident they're alone. She was on the phone with someone laughing softly. "No, I'm serious," she said. "We need to get him to sign the power of attorney while he still understands what he's signing." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed, the radiator ticked. Then I went back to the living room, sat in my chair, and picked up the newspaper I'd set down. My hands were steady. My mind was not. 3 days later, I had a reason to go into Kristen's home office to retrieve a charger he'd borrowed from me in November. He wasn't home. I found the charger on the edge of his desk, and next to it, half buried under a folder, was a printout of property valuation report, my address. The number at the bottom was $847,500. The date on the printout was from the previous week. I took the charger. I put the paper back exactly as I'd found it, face down, half under the folder, and I walked out of that office with the kind of calm that doesn't come from being unbothered. It comes from having made a decision you haven't fully formed yet, but whose outline you can already see. Here is something they don't teach you in law school, but 31 years in a prosecutor's office will. The most dangerous person in a courtroom is not the one who gets loud. It's the one who stays quiet and takes notes. I built my career on that principle. I had colleagues who were brilliant performers, thundering closings, theatrical cross-examinations. I was never that. I was the one who read every document twice, made timelines by hand, and waited for the moment when the story stopped matching the evidence. It was not glamorous work. It was effective work. Standing in my living room that evening with Kristen's property valuation printout fresh in my mind, I realized with a clarity that felt almost embarrassing in its lateness, I had been sitting across the table from this case for 2 years and treating it like it was someone else's problem. It was time to start treating it like it was mine. The first thing I did was go to the basement and find an old legal pad paper, spiral-bound, nothing digital. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table after Nicole and Kristen had gone to bed, and started writing. Not a journal, a case file. Dates, statements, specific incidents with specific wording. Every third-person comment, every casual question about my finances, every carefully placed comment about my memory made in front of a witness. I wrote for an hour and a half. By the end, I had 4 pages of notes and a cold cup of coffee I hadn't touched. The second thing I did 2 days later was stop at the Best Buy on North Avenue and buy a digital voice recorder for $89 in cash. Small, flat, easy to set on a bookshelf or rest in a shirt pocket. I'd used them before. Most people, when they're performing their version of concern and care, aren't thinking about whether they're being recorded in a private residence. They're thinking about how convincing they sound. I want to go back for a moment because it matters. About 12 years ago, Nicole drove up from Evanston. She was living there then before Crispin, and we spent the afternoon walking along the lakefront. She'd just gotten a promotion and wanted to tell me in person. We stopped at a hot dog stand on Belmont and ate standing up, watching the joggers go by, and she asked what I was most proud of from my career. I told her it wasn't any single case. It was the ones where I'd gotten it right when nobody was looking, where the right outcome happened because someone had done the unglamorous work correctly. She nodded like she understood. I think she did then. I don't know when that version of my daughter started making calculations. I don't know if it was before Crispin or because of him, whether he found in her something already there or introduced it slowly the way rust works. What I know is this: by the time I found that property valuation report, Nicole had been laying groundwork for months. The comments about my memory, the forgetfulness planted in front of neighbors, the concerned daughter performance whenever someone from outside was watching. It was a strategy, and it was a good one. People who've watched a parent age, genuinely age, with genuine confusion and genuine fragility, develop a specific kind of protectiveness that looks almost identical to control from the outside. Nicole was borrowing that language without paying the cost of having earned it. and she was doing it in front of witnesses, which meant she was building a record. A record that could, in the right circumstances, support a claim that her father wasn't fully capable of managing his own affairs. 2 days after I started my case file, I made a phone call to a former colleague. Not a friend. Just someone I'd worked alongside briefly on a joint task force now in civil practice. I kept it professional. I told him I'd heard the name Pinnacle Capital LLC come up and asked if he knew anything. He did a quick search while I waited. A civil judgment against one Chrisman Anthony Ward entered 11 months prior in the amount of $127,000. Payment due in full by the 1st of September. That was 7 and 12 months away. I sat with that number for a while. $127,000. Chrisman had 3 failed businesses, a golf habit, and a wardrobe that didn't match his income. He had a wife who managed her Instagram with the precision of a brand strategist and a father-in-law with an $840,000 house and a $310,000 investment account. The math wasn't subtle. I went to the Illinois State Bar Association website that same evening. I was looking for a specific type of attorney, estate planning trust law. Someone with actual trial experience, in case it came to that. I found Reginald Foster, 47 years old, 12 years in private practice, after a stint at a firm downtown. Rated 4.9 by peer review, the biography mentioned living trusts specifically. I called his office the next morning and made an appointment for the following Thursday. I want to tell you about one more memory before I get to that meeting. The summer, Nicole turned 16. She found out a girl at school had been spreading cruel rumors about her. She came home furious, shaking, wanting to confront the girl publicly. I sat her down at this kitchen table and said, "Nicole, anger is information. It tells you something is wrong, but it doesn't tell you what to do. Separate those two things. Figure out what you actually want, not what feels good right now. What you actually want. Then work backward from there." She handled the situation quietly and permanently. I was proud of her for 2 weeks. I thought about that conversation on the drive to Reginald Foster's office on the 33rd floor at 333 West Wacker Drive. I thought about it as I sat in his clean, spare conference room with a view of the river and laid out 2 weeks of documentation on the table in front of him. The case file, the specific incidents, the dates, the names of the witnesses Nicole had performed in front of. Foster read carefully. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said, "If they haven't moved yet, you have a window, but it's closing." I said, "How much time?" He looked up from the papers. "Weeks, not months." I drove home in the last of the afternoon light, watching Chicago slide past the car windows, the river, the Elras, the brick 3 flats that have stood in the city for 100 years. I had lived here my whole life. I had raised a daughter in that house on Levitt Street. I had bought it for $187,000 and watched it become $840,000 worth of someone else's plan. Not anymore. I pulled into the driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet. Then I took out the legal pad from my bag, flipped to a clean page, and wrote 2 words at the top. Case opened. When I was a junior prosecutor, a senior attorney named Gerald Simmons took me aside after I'd badly overplayed a hand in a fraud case. He said, "Edward, the defendant doesn't need to know your strategy. He just needs to believe he's winning." I was 29 years old and too proud to admit how much that landed. I've thought about Gerald a lot in recent weeks. The morning after I wrote case opened at the bottom of that legal pad, I called Reginald Foster's office and scheduled a second meeting. Then I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched Nicole move through her morning routine while I let her believe I was reading the Tribune. She is very good at what she does. The performance was subtle, which is what made it effective. When she refreshed my coffee, picking up the cup without asking, she held her chin at an angle that communicated patient caregiver to anyone watching. When she mentioned that she'd moved Dad's vitamin bottles to the counter so he wouldn't forget, the phrasing was deliberate. Not Edward, always Dad. It sounds warmer. It also positions me as a dependent, rather than a resident. Chrisman operated at a different frequency. Where Nicole performed warmth, Chrisman performed competence. He was on the phone constantly, always standing near the kitchen doorway where I could tell me, was that a man with a $127,000 was very interested. 3 weeks of listening told me exactly nothing had materialized. What it did tell me was that a man with a $127,000 debt due in September and no income stream had begun to look at my living room the way a drowning person looks at a piece of driftwood. I watched. I noted. I said nothing. The second meeting with Reginald Foster was on a Thursday morning. His office on the 12th floor at 333 West. Wacker Drive faces the river, and the light off the water at 9 inches the morning is something I'd recommend to anyone who finds clear thinking easier with a view. I'd brought my legal pad 13 pages by then, and the property valuation printout I'd photographed on my phone before replacing it on Chrisman's desk. Foster read through the notes without interrupting. He's the kind of attorney who processes information before responding, which I find professionally reassuring and personally compatible. When he finished, he set the pad on the table, aligned it with the edge, the way certain careful people do, and said, "Irrevocable living trust." I said, "Walk me through it." Here is what Foster explained. Under Illinois law, I can transfer my home from my personal name into a trust, the Edward T. Murphy Living Trust. While retaining full control during my lifetime, I remain trustee. I remain sole beneficiary. Nothing in my daily life changes. But from the moment that transfer is recorded with the Cook County Recorder of Deeds, the house no longer appears as a personal asset in my name, and a durable power of attorney can only grant authority over the grantor's personal assets. A trust has a trustee. You can't assign someone else as decision-maker for another person's trust without going through probate court with medical evidence, with a formal competency proceeding. In other words, the document Chrisman had been holding in reserve would become, the moment I signed the trust, a carefully prepared piece of nothing. Foster then asked about the investment account, $310, 0 inches, a brokerage account I'd held since 2003. I'd already updated the beneficiary designation the previous year during a routine review. He confirmed that was current, and we agreed no further change was necessary there. The trust would cover the house. The house was what they were after. I authorized Foster to begin drafting. His fee for preparation and filing, $4. $200. I wrote the check that afternoon. On the drive home, I stopped at the office of a private investigator named Steve Coleman, formerly 12 years with the Chicago Police Department, now running a one-room operation on North Clark. I'd found his name through the Illinois Association of Licensed Detectives and verified his license before calling. His reviews from attorneys who'd used him were consistent, thorough, discreet, on time. I told Coleman what I needed. Documentation of Chrisman Ward's movements, specifically any contact with notaries, attorneys, or financial institutions. Evidence of any attempts to influence me into signing documents. Nothing illegal. Observation and records the kind that hold up if they're ever needed. Coleman asked 4 precise questions and named his rate. $3. $500. Upfront. $150 per hour. For active surveillance written reports weekly. I wrote the check on the spot. Back home, I made dinner. Nicole told me she liked what I'd done with the spice rack. I thanked her pleasantly. The acting was starting to come naturally. 10 days later, Coleman delivered his first report. 4 pages, single-spaced. Chrisman's daily pattern. Gym, on Monday and Wednesday mornings. Lunch twice a week with a man Coleman identified as a former business associate. Golf on Saturdays. Nothing unusual for most of it. But on a Tuesday afternoon, Chrisman had driven 30 minutes north to a suburb called Morton Grove. He'd spent 40 minutes at the office of a notary. Not anyone connected to Foster's firm, not anyone. I'd contacted a man named Mark D. operating out of a strip mall between a dry cleaner and an insurance broker. Coleman had photographed the visit. He'd also photographed what Chrisman carried in a manila envelope, and what he carried out the same manila envelope, now visibly thicker. I sat with that report for a long while that evening. Then I picked up the phone and called Foster. "They have a document," I said. There was a brief pause. "Then we move faster," he said. That night I put on a Miles Davis record, Sketches of Spain, 1960 original Columbia pressing, and sat in the living room while Nicole and Chrisman watched something on the television upstairs. The bass line came in at the 3rd minute, and I followed it with my left hand against my knee. The way you follow something you've heard so many times it lives in the muscle. I thought about timing, about Gerald Simmons, about the difference between reacting and responding. The defendant doesn't need to know your strategy. He just needs to believe he's winning. Coleman's second report, delivered a week after the first, filled in the details I'd been missing. The document Chrisman had obtained from the notary in Morton Grove was a durable power of attorney, the specific kind that remains valid even if the principal is later determined to be incapacitated. Under Illinois law, a durable POA for property allows the named agent to buy, sell, manage, or transfer real estate on behalf of the grantor. It's a legitimate instrument when used legitimately, in the hands of someone with a $127,000 debt and a ready story about their father-in-law's declining mental capacity. It's something else entirely. The document named Nicole Ward as primary agent, Crispin Ward as secondary. It was not yet signed. It was, however, dated, notarized in blank, and ready to be placed in front of me at the right moment. That moment, it turned out, came on a Sunday evening in early April. Nicole cooked that night. Roast chicken, roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine she placed on the table without asking if I wanted any. The table was set properly. Cloth napkins, the good plates from the cabinet they'd reorganized. Crispin was in a blazer. Nicole wore a dress I hadn't seen before. I noticed all of this the way I used to notice when a witness arrived at court overdressed. It usually means they've rehearsed. After dinner, while the plates were still on the table, Nicole set her hands flat on the cloth and looked at me with an expression she had calibrated carefully. Serious but warm. The kind of look that says, "I've been worrying about this for a while and I care too much not to say something." "Dad," she said, "we need to talk about something important." I set down my fork. "Of course. Crispin and I have been thinking, we love you, and we want to make sure you're protected. If something happened to you, if there was ever an emergency and you couldn't make decisions, we'd need to be able to step in quickly. For the house, for the accounts. We just feel so much better knowing everything was in order." She slid a folder across the table. I did not open it. "That makes sense," I said. Nicole's shoulders relaxed slightly, just a degree, but I caught it. "There's a form in there, a power of attorney. Nothing scary. It just means that if you ever needed us to act, we could." I nodded. I let a moment pass. "You're right. Things should be in order." Crispin smiled. He lifted his wine glass. "I've actually already made an appointment with my own attorney," I said. "Next Thursday. He's going to handle everything properly." Nicole's smile stayed in place, but her eyes went a half-second flat. "That's great, Dad. That's a good idea." "I thought so," I said. "He's very thorough." I pushed back from the table and started clearing the dishes. Crispin refilled his glass. Neither of them said anything else about the folder. What I did not say that my appointment with Reginald Foster the following Thursday was not to sign a power of attorney. It was to sign the completed trust documents, the Edward T. Murphy Living Trust, drafted under Illinois 760 ILCS 3000-101, naming the Chicago Legal Aid Foundation as the sole beneficiary upon my death. It was also not to sign anything that put a single square foot of this house within reach of either of them. The signing took place on a Thursday morning at Foster's office. Dorothy Parker, a notary whose office was on the 4th floor of a building on West Jackson, had been arranged by Foster in advance. She arrived at 1000 with her seal and her professional composure. The documents ran to 22 pages. I read every one. When it was done, Dorothy Parker affixed her seal to the notarial certificate attached to each page. Foster signed as witness, and I signed as grantor, trustee, and beneficiary. The entire process took 45 minutes. The Cook County Recorder of Deeds would receive the deed transfer within 5 business days. After that, 2847 North Leavitt Street would no longer be listed under Edward Thomas Murphy in any personal property record. It would belong to the trust, the durable power of attorney sitting in a folder on my dining room table. The one Nicole had slid across the cloth with her carefully calibrated expression had just become useless before I'd ever touched it. I shook Foster's hand. I thanked Dorothy Parker. I took the elevator down to the lobby, walked out onto West Wacker, and stood for a moment in the April air while the river moved south below the bridge. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not triumph that would come later and in a different room. What I felt then was simpler than that. I felt like the case had enough evidence to proceed. I drove home, pulled into the driveway, walked through the front door. Nicole was at the kitchen table. In front of her, spread open and clearly mid-examination, was my mail. A utility statement, a letter from the investment brokerage, a notice from the recorder of deeds office confirming receipt of a filing. She looked up when I came in. Did not move her hands from the papers. Did not apologize. Just making sure you didn't miss anything important, she said. I looked at her for a moment. Then I took my coat off, hung it by the door, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. There are things you learn after 31 years of prosecution that no case ever fully teaches, and that experience deposits in you slowly the way sediment builds in still water. One of them is this: the moment your opponent stops being careful is the moment your case gets stronger. Nicole had just stopped being careful. The notice from the recorder of deeds was a standard processing confirmation. It would mean nothing to her tonight. By the time it meant something, it would be too late to matter. I poured my coffee. I did not look back at her. Outside, the last of the April light was going sideways through the kitchen window, catching the edge of the cabinet she'd reorganized 8 months ago. The mugs I never used were right where she'd put them. I picked up my own mug, the one I kept on the left side where it had always been, and carried it to my chair. The invitation from the Chicago Bar Association arrived by mail. Heavy cream envelope. The kind of stationary organizations use when they want you to understand that what's inside matters. Judith Hayes, the association's president, had signed the letter personally. The award was called the Cook County Justice Contribution Award, given annually to individuals who had made sustained contributions to the county's legal system. This year, I was the recipient. I read the letter twice, set it on the kitchen table, and went to make coffee. The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday evening 6 weeks out at the Fairmont Chicago on North Columbus Drive. Cocktail hour at 6:00, dinner, and program at 7:30. Formal dress, 200 guests, expected active and retired judges, state's attorneys, defense attorneys, law school faculty. The kind of room where 31 years of work gets its full accounting. I called Foster the next morning to let him know. "I'd like you to be there," I said. "First row if possible, and bring the documents." There was a brief pause on his end. "All of them. The trust certification, the notarized copies, everything you'd need if someone asked you in a public setting to confirm the status of my estate." Another pause, "Then I'll be there." I hung up and sat for a moment at my desk. Then I went downstairs and told Nicole and Crispin about the award over breakfast, mentioning it casually the way you mention a dry cleaning pickup or a dentist appointment. Nicole said, "That's wonderful, Dad," with the warmth she kept in reserve for moments when she needed to seem close to me. Crispin said, "Congratulations," without looking up from his phone. Then I said, "I'd like you both to come." That got his attention. He looked up. Nicole's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Of course," Nicole said, recovering first. "We'd love to." Crispin set his phone face down on the table. A gesture I'd learned over months of observation meant he was recalculating. "Sure," he said. "Wouldn't miss it." I nodded and returned to my breakfast. Over the following weeks, the house operated on its usual rhythms. Nicole's yoga classes, Crispin's phone calls about deals that never materialized, the quiet soundtrack of two people waiting for something to happen and too confident to be nervous about it. I watched from a careful distance and kept my legal pad current. Coleman checked in midway through with a brief update. Crispin had made no new contact with attorneys or notaries. The durable POA was still in the Morton Grove envelope waiting. I filed the report and moved on. The week before the banquet, Nicole asked what she should wear. I told her formal, and that she'd looked very nice at her cousin's wedding 2 years back. She smiled genuinely, I think, for a moment before she remembered what she was doing in this house. I had my dark suit dry cleaned and shoes resold at a shop on Lincoln Avenue. I took out the Miles Davis vinyl I'd been saving, kind of blue 1959 original 6E pressing, and set it beside the turntable for later. The evening of the banquet, I drove to the Fairmont separately, arriving early to speak with the organizers. Nicole and Crispin followed 40 minutes later. When they entered the grand ballroom on the 3rd floor, I was already at my assigned table near the front, in conversation with a former colleague from the state's attorney's office. The room filled steadily. Tables were set with white cloth and low floral arrangements. The bar had been open since 6, and the room had the particular energy of 200 lawyers who had stopped working for the evening but hadn't stopped thinking. I recognized perhaps 60 faces, judges I'd appeared before, attorneys I'd worked alongside, a few I'd crossed in court and respected more for it. Reginald Foster arrived at 1:07, and took his assigned seat in the first row next to a retired appellate judge named Warren Caldwell, who had presided over Cook County appeals for 22 years. Foster set his leather briefcase on the floor beside his chair. He did not open it. Nicole and Crispin found their seats at my table, 4 rows back. Nicole wore a dark green dress. Crispin had a rented tuxedo that fit well enough. He scanned the room with the reflexive appraisal of someone who categorizes people by net worth on sight, then settled back with his water glass. Dinner was served. At 7:55, Judith Hayes, silver-haired composed, took the podium. She worked through 2 brief presentations before arriving at the final award. The Cook County Justice Contribution Award, she said, recognizes an individual whose service has been sustained, substantive, and marked by personal integrity. This year's recipient spent 31 years as a senior assistant state's attorney. He tried more than 200 cases to verdict. He mentored prosecutors at every level of this office. I mentioned 2 colleagues by name. I mentioned the work itself. The unglamorous document, heavy detail-dependent work of building a case correctly when no one is watching. I did not look at Nicole or Crispin while I spoke. When I returned to my table, the room had shifted back into its normal current conversations, resuming chairs, adjusting 200 people deciding how to discuss what they'd witnessed. Foster caught my eye from the first row and gave a single brief nod. Nicole was in her seat, holding her water glass with both hands and staring at the tablecloth. Crispin sat with his arms crossed, his expression past shock, and into something harder, the look of a man recalculating what he had left. I sat. I finished my dinner. I spoke with a retired judge named Patricia Olson about a case we'd both worked near in 1998 that had recently appeared in a law school textbook. It was a good conversation. At the end of the evening, Foster found me. He shook my hand and said without elaboration, "Well handled." I thanked him and meant it. In the Fairmont lobby, while we waited for our coats, Nicole's mouth opened once. The beginning of something, a question, an argument. I don't know which. Then it closed. Crispin said nothing. His face had the set of a man already planning his next move without knowing what it was. I drove home through a Chicago May night that had turned cool and clear. Pulled into the driveway on Levitt Street. Went inside and set the Crystal Award on the shelf above the turntable right beside the Miles Davis pressing. I did not play it that night. There was still more to come. I was right about that. The applause had barely settled when Crispin moved. I was back at my seat, the Crystal Award on the table in front of me, when I saw him stand not toward me, but toward Reginald Foster, who was still in the first row, speaking quietly with Warren Caldwell. Crispin excused his way through 2 chairs and crossed the distance with the walk of a man who is trying to look unhurried and is not succeeding. I watched this from across the room and drank my water. Nicole had not moved. She was still at our table, sitting straight, hands flat on the cloth, a posture I recognized as controlled shock, the kind that comes when the operating assumption of a plan has been removed and nothing has yet replaced it. Crispin reached Foster and spoke in a low voice. Foster listened, turned slightly to face him, and responded. I couldn't hear the exchange from where I sat, but I'd been a prosecutor long enough to read a conversation from body language at 40 feet. Crispin's posture went from pressing to still. His shoulders dropped by a fraction. His chin came up, the physical response of a man absorbing information he was hoping to disprove. He came back to the table and sat beside Nicole. He leaned close and said something in her ear, his hand on her forearm. Nicole listened. Her face, which had been carefully blank, began to change. It went the way these things go when the information is serious. First a small tightening around the eyes, then a loosening of the jaw, then a particular kind of pallor that doesn't come from temperature. She turned to look at Foster. He was still in conversation with Caldwell, and did not look back. Then she stood up and walked to him directly. I set down my water glass. "Who is the beneficiary?" Nicole asked. Her voice was low, but I was close enough now. I had walked to the edge of the program section, which was legitimate. People were moving around. The formal part of the evening was over. I was perhaps 15 feet away when she asked the question. Foster looked at her with the neutral expression attorneys learn and never fully unlearn. "The Chicago Legal Aid Foundation," he said. "It's a matter of public record once the trust is registered." Nicole absorbed this for a moment. Then she turned and looked at me across the room. I was holding my water glass. I met her eyes and did not look away. What happened next took perhaps 2 seconds, and was, I will admit, not something I had anticipated precisely in those terms, though I had considered the possibility. Her knees went first, a subtle buckle, the kind that happens before the body has caught up to what the mind has registered. Chrisman, who was standing 2 feet away, moved fast. He got an arm around her before she reached the floor. She didn't fall. She subsided, which is different. The body deciding it no longer has the structural interest in remaining upright. There was a brief commotion. A woman from a nearby table called out. Someone flagged the hotel's event staff. Within 3 minutes, a first aid team from the hotel had arrived. 2 staff members with a kit, composed and professional. They helped Nicole to a chair, checked her pulse, asked her standard questions. She was conscious and responsive. Her color was returning. I walked over and stood at a reasonable distance. The medical staff asked if I was family. Her father, I said. The young woman with the kit looked up. She's okay. Appears to be a vasovagal response. The body's reaction to an acute shock. It passes. I know, I said. She's in good health. I looked at Nicole briefly, then at the staff member. It was news she wasn't prepared for. Crispin was standing next to Nicole with his hand on her shoulder. He looked at me over the top of her head. His expression was not the shock his wife's had been. It was harder than that. It was the look of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and who is now running every available alternative through a mind that is good at finding angles even when the room is running out of them. I held his look for a moment, then I nodded once, not warmly, not coldly, simply the acknowledgement of one person to another, and returned to my table to collect the award. The room had resettled by then. People were doing what people at formal events do when something unexpected occurs. They were talking about something else slightly too energetically, the way you talk around a subject rather than about it. Several people stopped me on the way out to say congratulations. A few pressed my hand. Warren Caldwell near the exit said, "Edward, good work," which coming from him was a summation. I thanked Judith Hayes at the door and drove home. The house was quiet when I arrived. I set the award on the shelf, sat in my chair and opened my legal pad to a fresh page. At the top I wrote 2 words, phase complete. Then I went to bed. The following morning I came downstairs to find a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. My name. On the outside, Crisen's handwriting. "We need to talk. This isn't over." I read it twice, set it back on the table, made coffee. He was right about one thing. It wasn't over. But the terms had changed. And he didn't fully know that yet. 3 days after the banquet, Foster called me. "Crisen Ward has retained an attorney," he said. "A man named Douglas Frell. Civil litigation downtown. They've filed a petition to contest the trust on grounds of lack of testamentary capacity at the time of execution." I sat down my coffee. Testamentary capacity. It's the standard challenge when there's no other argument available. They're claiming you didn't fully understand what you were signing. I thought about this for a moment. What do they have right now? Nicole's statement that you've been confused and forgetful. Crisen's corroboration of the same. A pause. No medical records, no physician's assessment, no independent witnesses with direct knowledge. And we have Dorothy Parker's notarial certificate, which includes a standard competency attestation, the video from the banquet. Warren Caldwell's office is sending over a copy from the event photographer, written statements from 3 of your former colleagues in the state's attorney's office, which I'll be requesting within the week. And Coleman's documentation of the prior conduct of the Morton Grove notary. Visit the property valuation printout, which establishes a pattern of intent on their side that the court will find relevant context. I said, when's the preliminary hearing? 4 weeks. Cook County Circuit Court Probate Division Judge Miriam Ofor presiding. I told him to proceed. We agreed to meet the following Monday to review the full evidentiary package. That same week, Coleman delivered his final report: 3 visits to the Morton Grove notary, photographed 2 calls Crisen made to a real estate attorney's office, dates obtained through civil process records. The property valuation printout confirming the appraisal was commissioned 6 weeks before the durable POA was prepared. Individually, none of it criminal. Together, a documented pattern. I forwarded everything to Foster. The following Monday, we reviewed the full package at his office on Westwacker. The banquet video was, Foster said, the strongest single piece in the set. They claimed incapacity publicly before 200 colleagues 27 days after the trust was signed, he said. The same man they say couldn't understand documents gave a coherent public address and accepted a professional honor. Any judge who sees that footage and reads their petition is going to have a credibility problem with the petitioners. Chances at the preliminary, I asked. Dismissal for insufficient foundation. They'd need an independent medical evaluation to proceed. They don't have one and haven't requested one. He was right about that. 3.5 weeks later, I sat in the third row of a Cook County probate courtroom and watched Douglas Frell argue his client's petition before Judge Miriam Affor, a compact woman with reading glasses on a chain who had the expression of someone who has heard every available version of every available argument. Frell spoke for 18 minutes. Foster responded in 9. Judge Okafor asked 4 questions, 2 of which were directed at the petitioner's side, and both of which had the particular quality of questions that already contained their own answer. She dismissed the petition without prejudice. The trust stood. Crizen was sitting in the row behind me. I heard him exhale when the judge ruled not a sigh but a controlled breath. The sound of someone managing a response they don't want visible. I did not turn around. Outside the courtroom in the marble corridor, Frell spoke briefly with Foster. They were professional about it. 2 attorneys who had been in rooms like this before, and would be again. Crizen stood near the elevator with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the floor tile. Nicole had not come. She'd been at home, I knew, because I'd seen her car in the driveway when I left that morning. I walked to the elevator and stood a reasonable distance from Crizen while we waited. He didn't look up. The elevator arrived. We both stepped in. The doors closed. 12 floors down. Neither of us had said a word. Then Crizen said, "That's not the last move available to us." I looked at the elevator doors. "I know," I said. He glanced at me sideways. He'd expected something different. Resistance argument. A crack in the composure. What he got was agreement delivered without affect. The doors opened at the lobby. I walked out first. 3 days later, the letter arrived. It came in a standard business envelope addressed to Crizen Ward, care of 2847 N. Levitt Street. The return address was a law firm, Pinnacle Capital LLC, Collections Division, 444 North Michigan Avenue, Suite 900. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and went to make coffee. When Crizen came down an hour later, I pointed to the envelope without comment. He picked it up, read the return address, and went still. He took it upstairs without opening it in front of me. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and turned to the Tribune's crossword. 17 across was a 5-letter word for natural consequence. I filled it in without much difficulty. The word was karma, but that felt too convenient, so I double-checked the crossing letters. It was repay. Close enough. The letter from Pinnacle Capital LLC sat on the kitchen counter for 3 hours before Crizen came downstairs. I had not opened it. It was addressed to him. I simply set it where he would see it propped against the fruit bowl, face up, the return address visible from the doorway. Then I made coffee, sat at the table, and read the Tribune. He came down at 9:09 in his robe, moving with the slightly slower pace of a man who hadn't slept well. He saw the envelope immediately. His hand went to it, then pulled back as if he needed a moment to prepare before picking it up. He read the return address. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed into a careful blankness he'd been practicing since the banquet. He took the envelope upstairs without a word. I turned the page of the newspaper. 3 days later, he came to me in the evening. I was in the living room going through my arbitration notes for the following week. He knocked on the doorframe, the first time in 2 years he'd bothered, and stood in the entrance with his hands loose at his sides. "Edward," he said, "I need to talk to you." I set my notes on the side table. "All right." He came in and sat in the chair across from me, Nicole's chair, as it had come to function in recent months. He looked at his hands for a moment, then looked at me with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is deciding at the last moment to set the script aside. "I owe Pinnacle Capital $127,000, he said. "The deadline passed. They're going to pursue collection. If I can't resolve this in the next 60 days, it goes to wage garnishment and credit judgment." He paused. "I need $50,000. I'll sign a promissory note, whatever you want. I'll pay it back in 2 years. I listened to all of this without interrupting. Then I said, "I'll think about it." He looked at me. He was trying to read whether that was a yes, with conditions, or a no, dressed as a delay. He couldn't tell. That was by design. Thank you, he said. He stood up and left the room. I sat for a while after he'd gone. I had no intention of lending Kristen Ward $50,000. I had no intention of lending him $5,000 or $1 or any amount in any form. But I'll think about it by time, and time in this situation was the only currency that mattered. Every week that passed was a week closer to September. And September was when the debt clock expired, and Pinnacle Capital's collections process began in earnest. I was not going to do anything to help them. I was not going to do anything to hurt them either. I was simply going to be entirely unavailable as a solution to a problem they had built entirely by themselves. Nicole's attempt came a week later. She cooked dinner, a proper one with effort, the kind of meal that signals intent before anything is said. Talked about small things. Talked about small things. A story from her yoga class, something she'd read. Then over the last of dinner, she sat down her fork and looked at me directly. Dad, she said, I want to apologize for the banquet. What I did was wrong. I should never have done that. I looked at her for a moment. Her eyes were clear. Whatever calculation lived behind them, and I knew it did. She had set it aside for this particular sentence. She meant it, or a portion of it. People are rarely entirely sincere or entirely false. I accept that, I said. She nodded. A silence. Things have been very hard, she said. I know, I said. She didn't push further that night. And I didn't change anything in the documents. 2 weeks after that conversation, I called Foster and asked him to draft a formal notice of termination of occupancy under Illinois Code of Civil Procedure. Specifically, the provision that applies to occupants without a lease. The notice required them to vacate the property at 2847 North Levitt Street by the first day of October, 60 days from service. Foster prepared the notice and sent it by certified mail and personal service the following day. I was in my study when the process server knocked. I heard Kristen answer the door. I heard the brief exchange. I heard the door close. Then I heard nothing for a long while. That night at 1100 my phone rang. Nicole, I answered on the third ring. You can't do this, she said. Her voice was controlled, but just barely. The control of someone gripping something that is pulling in the opposite direction. We have nowhere to go. You're throwing your own daughter out. I let her finish. Then I said, Nicole, I gave you 2 years in a house. Now you have 60 days and your dignity. Don't waste either one. The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dad. Good night, Nicole. I said, and I hung up. I sat in the dark for a while after that, listening to the house upstairs muffled through the ceiling. I could hear movement. 2 people rearranging their situation in their minds, and then a little later beginning to make calls. I heard Kristen's voice low and clipped the tone of a man calling in whatever remained to be called in. I went to bed. They left on the morning of October 1st. I was up early as I usually am and made coffee before they came downstairs with the first load. Kristen had rented a moving truck, a white one, 6-footer, that sat double-parked on Levitt Street with its hazard lights on. 2 men he'd hired helped carry boxes. Nicole moved between the house and the truck with a focused economy of motion, the kind that happens when a person has decided that efficiency is the only remaining form of dignity available to them. I stayed out of their way. I sat in the kitchen with my coffee in the Tribune and gave them the room they needed. Pinnacle Capital's collections judgment had been entered 2 weeks prior, and Crispin had negotiated a repayment structure on his own without my involvement, which were the correct terms. They had found a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston at $2,100 a month, a significant step down from a house worth $840,000. But it was theirs in a way this house had never been. At noon, Nicole came into the kitchen. The truck was loaded. Crispin was outside, talking to one of the movers. She stood near the door, her coat on her keys in her hand. She looked around the kitchen, the reorganized cabinet, the counter, the window over the sink with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between loss and the particular flatness that follows the end of a thing you'd been sustaining for a long time. Dad, she said. Nicole. She looked at me. I didn't think you'd actually do it, she said. Not an accusation, a statement, an honest one. I know, I said. She stood there a moment longer. Then she nodded once the way people nod when there's nothing left to argue about and walked out. The door closed. I listened to the truck start up. I listened to it pull away from the curb, the engine diminishing down Levitt Street toward Montreux and then gone. I sat with my coffee for a while. The house was very quiet. Not the tense, occupied quiet of the past 2 years, the quiet of people performing normally and calculating behind it, but a different kind, the quiet of a space that has returned to its original purpose, which is to be mine. I went to the living room, took kind of blue from the shelf the original six-eyed pressing I'd been saving, and set it on the turntable. The needle found the groove and the opening piano came in, and then Paul Chambers' bass and I stood there listening for a moment before going to get my contrabass from the corner. I played along from the second track through the fourth, following the changes the way you follow them when you've heard an album enough times that the music lives somewhere below conscious thought. It wasn't a performance. It was just the proper way to fill a quiet house on a particular morning. Afterward, I called Foster to let him know the property was clear. He confirmed the trust documentation was fully in order. The court petition long since dismissed. The case file closed on his end. I thanked him. He said it had been straightforward, which was generous. It had been thorough, which is different. I told him I'd send the final payment that week. He said there was no rush. I sent it the same day. Then I called Judith Hayes. She answered on the second ring and laughed when I said my name. "Edward, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. I wanted to thank you," I said, "for the evening at the Fairmont." "I should be thanking you," she said. "That was the most memorable ceremony we've held in 20 years. People are still talking about it." "I hope it wasn't too disruptive," I said, which was a small lie and we both knew it. "Not at all," she said pleasantly. "It was instructive." We spoke for a few minutes about the association's fall program and then I let her go. That afternoon I called Foster and told him I wanted one amendment to the trust's distribution schedule, the original name, the Chicago Legal Aid Foundation as sole beneficiary upon my death. I wanted to add a conditional bequest, $40,000 to Nicole Ward, contingent on her not contesting the trust in any form within 5 years of my death. If she contested, the bequest was void. Foster was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual addition," he said. "It's a considered one," I said. He said the amendment would be ready by the end of the week. I want to be precise about what that addition was: not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a different instrument, not warmth. It was a condition clearly stated and legally enforceable. Behave correctly after I'm gone. And there is something for you. An incentive structure that aligns behavior with consequence. The rest is up to her. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening in October, I was on the small stage at the Green Mill on North Broadway. The late shift had its regular slot, and I had been absent most of the summer. It was good to be back. The room was 2/3 full. The light at the Green Mill is the color of old brass. We ran through 4 standards and 1 original. And the room responded the way it does when the music is working. Not loudly, but with the particular attention that means people have stopped thinking about other things. During the break, a man at the next table asked if I was in the band. I said yes. He said he liked the bass, that it anchored everything. I thanked him. He had no idea what the man with the contrabass had spent the previous 8 months doing. He didn't need to know. I spent 31 years convincing juries that evidence speaks for itself. It turns out the principle holds at home, too. I went back to the stage and picked up the bass. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.